Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. This is episode 70 of the Casual Stream. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter, and support me on Locals, Subscribestar, and Buy Me a Coffee. So tonight's discussion will be how Tolkien's view on magic helps us understand the machine. So first, I'm going to briefly read some select citations from Tolkien to illustrate many of his concepts about magic, explain those, and then move into the analysis of them. So, from the chapter The Council of Elrond, Fellowship of the Rings, and he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. Mirror of Galadriel, Fellowship of the Ring. And you, she said, turning to Sam, for this is what your folk would call magic. I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean, and they seem to use the same word for the deceits of the enemy. But this, if you will, is the magic of Galadriel. Did you not say that you wish to see elf magic? Now, these are two references from the book, which are important, and I'll get to a little bit later. But now there are two letters which go into significant detail as to what Tolkien meant by magic. So this one is a 1951 letter written to one Milton Waldman. And an excerpt from that letter reads, "For making the will more quickly effective, and so to the machine or magic. By the last I intend all use of external inner powers or talents, or even the use of these talents with the corrupt motive of dominating, bulldozing the real world, or coercing other wills. The machine is our more obvious modern form, though more closely related to magic than is usually recognized. I have not used magic consistently, and indeed the elven queen Galadriel is obliged to remonstrate with the hobbits on their confused use of the word, both for the devices of the enemy and for those of the elves. I have not, because there is not a word for the latter, since all human stories have suffered the same confusion. But the elves are there in my tales to demonstrate that difference. Their magic is art, delivered from many of its human limitations, more effortless, more quick, more complete. Product and vision in unflawed correspondence. And its object is art, not power, subcreation, not domination, and tyrannous reforming of creation. The elves are immortal, at least as far as the world goes, and hence are concerned rather with griefs and burdens of deathlessness and time and change than with death. The enemy's successive forms is always naturally concerned with sheer domination. And so the Lord of Magic and Machines, but the problem that this frightful evil can and does arise from its apparently good root, the desire to benefit the world and others, speedily and accordingly to the benefactor's own plan, is a recurrent motive." Excerpt from a draft of a letter Tolkien wrote to one Naomi Mitchison. I think it was letter 155 in the collected letters of Tolkien. But I suppose that for the purpose of the tale, some would say that there is a latent distinction, such as one was called the distinction between Magia and goetia. Galadriel speaks of the deceits of the enemy well enough, but Magia was held good per se, and goetia bad. Neither is in this tale good or bad per se, only by motive or purpose or use. Both sides use both with different motives. The supremely bad motive is, for this tale, since it is specifically about it, domination of other free wills. The enemy's operations are by no means all goetic, deceits but magic that produces real effects in the physical world. But the Magia he uses is to bulldoze both people and things, and the goetia to terrify and subjugate. The Magia the elves and Gandalf use sparingly. A Magia produce real results like fire on a wet faggot for several beneficent purposes. Their goetic effects are almost entirely artistic and not intended to deceive. They never deceive elves, but may deceive or bewilder unaware men, since the difference to them is as clear as the difference between fiction, painting, sculpture, and life. So, within Tolkien's conception of magic, there's broadly two types: that which creates the appearance of a thing, but is only a shadow or an illusion, which he calls goetia, and then that which affects a real change in the world, magia. So you could argue that, like the example that was given, was making wet wood burn. Also, when Gandalf lights the acorn on fire in The Hobbit to throw out the wolves, that would be magia. Some sort of illusion or shroud. A good example is from the Silmarillion, where Sauron seduces one of Barathir's followers by deceiving him into thinking that he sees his wife, and he offers to return her to him if he betrays Barathir. that would be goetia. And so he would argue, Tolkien seems to be arguing that in like human discourse, the one is bad, the other is good. But in his world, they're neither bad nor good. Both sides use them. What makes one good or bad is their intent. And in both of these letters that I read, he mentions the idea of bulldozing, destroying or overcrowding something, right? So when Gandalf says to Saruman, he who breaks a thing to understand a thing has departed the path of wisdom, that's sort of like the sort of self-insert where this idea being that you've destroyed the thing in order to understand it, but now it's destroyed, so it's not a thing anymore. Now, what is important, I think, here is how we can talk about what loosely is called elf magic, the idea that there are latent internal capacities that are developed versus the use of some external force that one might operate or use. So, for example, the ring, one might use the ring. And throughout his written works, letters and supplementary material, as well as in the Council of Elrond itself, Tolkien has, says that you might be able to displace the will of Sauron with your own will, but you only become a new Dark Lord. So even if you could use it, you would only replace one Sauron with another. Which is interesting because this is the same concept of deterritorialization that Guattari and Deleuze discussed that I already mentioned last week with Mike of Pole, where we talk about how, the power structure is still the same, the incentives are still the same. It's just different people operating that system. So moving on, the entire scientific project was rooted in this notion of discovering or conquering nature. We often hear aversion to refer to territory not yet put to use by man. Nature was seen as a virgin to be despoiled or revealed by artifice. The goal was, of course, to protect man from harm of floods, famine, and plagues, end strife between men and build a brighter future. The danger to do good that Tolkien foresaw. There you go, right? So we're going to do this for good. We're gonna break things up to hedge against these other, bads. Knowledge was acquired by observation, of course, but breaking things became the means by which these secrets were discovered. Let us break it to see what is inside became the byword for this process. And so the scientific process itself is this sort of like within the, using Tolkien's schema, this will to dominate, this imposition of use of power to break and subjugate things. You could also argue that things like propaganda and Hollywood and all these other groups would be like the goetia of deception and illusion to get people to go along. So using Tolkien's framework, modern science and mechanical civilization is Magia in the service of a dominating will for the remaking of men and nature. He once called the internal combustion engine a Mordor machine. With each passing decade and each corresponding change in material conditions, as a result of ever newer, more sophisticated and powerful machines, what Toffler calls future shock, and that's just the lag between each iteration and changing conditions is shorter and shorter and shorter until it approaches instantaneous. Man is giving more and more of his own capacities to machines. Marx was in some sense speaking to this when he discussed alienation from work. He argued it was a result of the employer directing the nature of your work and skimming off the surplus value. Whereas here I would like to argue that the alienation is the result of man giving up his own inherent capacity to make a thing to the machine. For example, blacksmithing requires the man to develop strength, muscle memory, and mental skills, etc., in order to make objects of iron and or steel. When all you have to do is hold a piece of fired steel with tongs and let a press stamp it into shape, what have you done? What have you lost? You have in fact done nothing. Any monkey or nowadays machine can hold a piece of hot steel the same way you do. It is repetitive and inane. You have lost the inherent inner qualities, elf magic, in order to make something by your own craft and skill. You no longer have anything to be proud of. So not only do you not contribute to the making of the thing in any meaningful way, and that thing is not really the product of your will and intent, you don't have any control over it either. It's something that is beyond your control, right? Especially with the process of the division of labor in production. If you're building a car or a ship or an airplane, well, all of a sudden you're just one small part of the whole thing. Now, the boomers were the first generation to really be devoid of these inherent talents. We've all asked boomers for advice in seemingly trivial matters, and they could not tell us how to do it. The silent generation lived through the Great Depression and had to learn real hands-on skills. Before them, the GI generation lived on farms and still had to figure things out without the aid of machines. We see this highlighted in the fact that now that the boomers have retired, nobody cares about them. Their power, respect, and prestige were all on loan from something else. This is also, of course, why we have a competency crisis. Incompetent people have no inherent capacity. They rely totally on the external magic of the machine to work for them. Such people are ideal for the machine. They pose no threat to it. They cannot, in fact, live without it. The bargain is you cede to the machine your responsibility and capacity in order to gain the power of a god. The catch is you eventually become obsolete and lose that power. When you lose that power, you are left a hollowed-out wraith. The wraithing process that Tolkien describes with the Rings of Power is the process of giving up of yourself to the will of another, having an attenuated existence. That is what happens when we give in to the machine. We have given in to the will behind it and become wraiths ourselves. Some wraiths are weak and petty like Gollum, and others are strong and powerful like the Witch King. So, for those who remember my last conversation with Derek Jensen, where I talk about the malevolent intelligence behind the machine, that is the will guiding the machine, and also, like Sauron, the will that's bending us to his purposes. We can see the petty revenge-seeking of the constituency of the woke left mirrored in Gollum. Once he got the Ring of Power, he did not seek to help others, but to get back at them for real or perceived wrongs. By himself, Gollum was not able to cause much harm, and likewise those people are not either. As part of an organization or bureaucracy and working in concert, they are. So, in this regard, that's kind of like the orcs, right? Morgoth and Sauron have legions of orcs. They're not really all that much to worry about on their own, but as a part of this organized body directed by the Dark Lord and supported by his other minions like trolls and Mumakils and Nazgul, then all of a sudden that's a serious problem. As machines take more and more of our capacity away, as they do more and more work for us, those who do not resist the process all become impotent wraiths, more akin to Gollum than the Nazgul. And now that we live not by our own efforts, Uncle Ted's the power process, but by these mechanical toys we have chosen to serve, this is the real reason why the regime is still intact. The men who in past ages had capacity to act do not any longer exist, either because they traded that capacity for comfort, power, and ease, boomers and Xers, or due to growing up in a toxic modem society, never were able to develop those capacities in the first place, millennials and zoomers. For example, how did one develop capacity in the past? By doing. More specifically, by an apprenticeship under someone who already had the capacity. For example, blacksmithing, right? Yeah, you learned by doing, but you became an apprentice to a blacksmith who showed you how to do it. He already knew how, right? And this gets to the basic principle, you cannot give what you do not possess. So, with the older generations, they received this power that was loaned to them by the machine. And they think that represents some inherent innate quality about themselves. And then when they start to, mentor young people, have children, train people to replace them, they are unable to successfully communicate to them because they mistook the power that was loaned to them for their own power. And so lacking what they're trying to give, having either never been given it themselves or having forgotten it or never developed it, we have this disconnect in the transfer of knowledge and information. This is no longer the case. Those with capacity pull up the ladder and throw boiling oil on you from the castle walls and gatekeep their skills by offering them to the highest bidder. Spoiler alert, teenagers cannot avoid their rates. Or as stated earlier, such men and environments for training do not exist or do not exist in sufficient numbers. This cannot be emphasized enough, right? The idea of growing up in suburbia or the city, having helicopter parents, and all of these systems of regulation in the government for what you can and can't do creates this sort of like bubble wrap society where people can't really do anything that could even remotely get them hurt, at least in a more conventional sense. I argue a lot of these regulations are actually to keep the infrastructure of the machine safe, because if you read Thurston Veblen and you read about the machine process, you can't have that disrupted. If that's disrupted, it's a systematic failure and is disastrous. They can't have that. And that's why the machine will fail. They have to keep pouring more and more energy into holding the freezing time so that nothing happens, so that nothing can disrupt the machine process. But eventually they're going to run out of energy and they can't do that. And then people and environmental factors will start cracking the infrastructure. Or as it turns out, the infrastructure won't actually be kept up, as we're seeing now in the United States. And eventually that mad effort to freeze time will fail. But you can't develop these capacities like you could in the past. I mean, for those that read literature, anybody that's read even any of the children's literature from the 19th and early 20th century, kids were going out and about and engaging with all sorts of things. Other kids, animals, adults on the job. And it was much more rough and tumble, and they learned things that, physical things that you just don't learn anymore. This is, of course, unprecedented in history, whereby the transfer of knowledge with regard to capacity to the next generation is stalled. For example, in a Native American village, the father or next of kin did not tell the young teenage brave, figure out how to hunt on your own, bud, or pay me in deer meat to teach you. He patiently mentored the youth to prepare him for the hunt. This no longer happens. The selfish, short-sighted method of thinking will lead to the catastrophic results as we go further into what James Howard Kunstler calls a long emergency, or Joseph Tainter calls collapse. Cutting out the rungs of the ladder and throwing them into the incinerator, all in the name of bulldozing the created order, was, to put in the words of the Uncle Tad, has been a disaster for the human race. So there's an awful lot to unpack here, but let's start from the top. One of the things that actually inspired me to do this episode was, I think it was on Twitter, the Black Horse had like a poll, like, well, if we got rid of X, would it lead to the collapse of the regime? And these were all various, vices that keep people pacified. And a lot of people are like, well, if you remove, these or that vices, the system would collapse. But the problem is, the reason why the system still exists, well, it's complicated, but one of the main reasons why it still exists is that men lack the capacity to act, right? We don't have men that can meet like the founding fathers in a pub, plan a revolution, and then execute that revolution. They don't exist anymore. So part of that is because they themselves have divested capacity of their own ability to do work or to do or create things to the machine, the very thing that they would end up having to rebel against. Because even if they were to successfully overthrow the U.S. government, like say a la Moldbug, and then manage the machine all over again, well, you're stuck in the process of reterritorialization, which doesn't change anything at all. You might, as we saw with the decolonization efforts, a lot of what the indigenous people were complaining about under the old colonial authorities continued under the new governments. Because the actual problem was this system of, what Nick Land calls techno-capital that was in place. And as long as that's in place, this problem will remain. But it's created this catch-22. On the one hand, it secures itself by creating a bunch of impotent dependents who can't actually do anything without recourse to the system itself. So in that regard, it locks in all these people as compliant, docile serfs. But then the other problem is they can't actually do anything, including fixing the machine. And we see this with the infrastructure degradation. So a few years ago, there was a lot of forest fires in California. And some of them, to my knowledge, were started by transformers shorting out. A lot of infrastructure really goes back to the Eisenhower days. It hasn't been replaced. Repairing infrastructure is very difficult. Also, because of the lack of the communication of knowledge. Now, you could argue in part that was the boomers and the Gen X being selfish, trying to protect their positions. Sure. But I think it's even worse than that. They couldn't transfer the knowledge because they had given up of their own internal capacities. So, a teacher, in order to teach, right? So this is to make a small digression. Teaching as a art, again, so we're going to use the elf magic, the art, the cultivated internal self, is an expression of the love of Eros, where you give birth to an idea in someone else. Plato describes this in the Theaetetus and in the Symposium. To be a good teacher, you have to have that trait, that internal driving spirit, as well as the capacity to communicate knowledge effectively to other people. Most of these older generations had neither. They might have had it at one point, right? A lot of times what ends up happening is you have these starry-eyed visionaries and idealists, and then they integrate into this system, and they gradually start giving up of themselves. Okay, so what's actually happened is what Morgoth did in reverse. So in the Silmarillion, what Morgoth does is he gives up of his own essence to corrupt Arda, to control Arda. And so Tolkien says in one of his letters that Sauron, at the end of The Lord of the Rings, with the ring, was more powerful because he drew power to himself than Morgoth was at the end of the Silmarillion, right before the War of Wrath. It's interesting. But the point is, he became weaker and weaker and weaker as a Vala because he gave up of himself to others in order to corrupt them. Well, in order to interface with the machine, you have to give up of yourself so that you lack internal capacity. So like Morgoth, these technicians, these cogs, these worker bees kept on giving up of themselves, becoming less and less and less and less. It won't kill you necessarily. It didn't kill Morgoth. But the point is, that's what's happened. And so in order to, again, act against the machine, going back to the regime, rather, going back to the poll that I saw on the Black Horse's Twitter, this is why it's not happening. Because they would have to use the tools of the regime against the regime. That's not how it works. You have to be able to step outside of it. So for example, going back to the example of the founding fathers actually starting a revolution in a pub, these were all men that had inherent capacities. They could lead, they could fight, they could farm, they could do all sorts of things. They could give speeches. And so with all these inherent capacities, they were, and then the men that they convinced to rebel against the British as well, had similar capacities, but to a lesser degree. Obviously, they weren't American aristocracy like the founding fathers were, but nonetheless, that's what these people did, and we just don't have that anymore. And so this leads, of course, to a something that's completely insane if you think about it, right? So from the earliest recorded human history right up until the industrial civilization, for example, depending on which society you had, either men or women were taught to skin animals to then turn the skin into leather and the meat into food. That's lost. That's just completely lost. That knowledge was not passed on because it was deemed irrelevant, because we had done better with global food production in the machine. But when the machine collapses, then this will all have to be learned from scratch. Now, as I mentioned before in some of my collapse videos, you're likely to find some niche people that could step in, like say glass blowers or blacksmiths that work for reenactment societies. But even they would have a hard time because they still depend upon an interconnected global economy in order to do what they do. They're just at the tail end doing it, old school. And so in that regard, it would still be a challenge. And so what does this do? Well, this sort of war on elf magic by the machine makes us all dependent, right? We're dependent and impotent, right? So we're dependent on the machine to do things for us that we could have otherwise done for ourselves, but can't. That's one. And two, the other thing is it makes us impotent. We lack the ability to to do things or to learn new things. So, right, you might say, well, it infantilizes us, right? What makes an infant an infant? The fact that it can't do anything itself. It has no inherent capacities that it can act on. So that as we give up to the machine, we become more like infants, which is why we see a rise in neoteny. I think we saw it first in women, but now we're seeing it in men as well. And so this rise in neoteny is the fact that we have created a society in which you not only need not develop these capacities that would make you more of a man, you're actively discouraged from doing so because you're considered disruptive and dangerous to the machine itself. And, we could talk about also how the illusion, right? Obviously, if we just look at the thing for what it is and the stark cold realities of, say, the way Forrester does in The Machine Stops, or the way Russell does and his scientific outlook, it's pretty hideous. It's pretty stark. It's really hard to think about the world working that way. So two things are done, right? Using this sort of like illusion magic, the goetia. The machine creates smoke and light shows, right? Propaganda, 24-hour news cycle, movies, music, all of which are to distract us or to draw us away or to create an impression of what isn't there. Rather than looking at this mechanical infrastructure and saying that this is reality, this is what's real, we're not supposed to look at that. We're supposed to look at everything else, which it creates in order to obfuscate its existence. It must do so because otherwise we destroy it. That's why we had Luddites. Luddites saw it for what it was and they wanted to dismantle it. Their heroic efforts failed. And so in order to deal with the neo-Ludditism, in part, they do this. You can also profit from it too by creating constructed consumer identities. That's great as well. But ultimately, you have to hide it so that it doesn't get attacked and destroyed. And you also have to hide it so that the machine process can continue uninterrupted, going back to Veblen. So, and again, to see through that is extremely difficult. And ultimately, two things are going on. One is, as energy levels go down, this is a purely defensive measure, right? This doesn't actually add value to the machine. It just deflects from any potential reaction to the machine. And it still needs to do that for that reason. Otherwise, you'd have, neo-Ludditism. You'd have the Unabomber en masse, right? But if you don't know who's doing it to you and what's happening to you, you're just kind of left dazed and confused. But that costs energy. And that's going to keep, it's going to be consumed as it goes down. Now, going back to Tainter and Catabolic Collapse, it's going to cannibalize itself. Eventually, what I would expect to see, and what I think we already are seeing, is that as the machine cannibalizes itself in order to maintain energy equilibrium for its own maintenance, it will end up cannibalizing part of the smoke and mirrors apparatus and b giving less energy to it. They're happening at the same time dynamically. That will mean it'll be easier to see what's happening. It'll be easier to see what is happening. And I think another reason why the internal capacity, the elf magic, has been attacked is that one of the things that Tolkien goes throughout his works again and again and again is things are not as they seem, right? When they meet Strider at Bree, there's a poem, and there's a line in the poem that says, "Not all who wander are lost," right? Strider, Aragorn, is the wanderer, but he's not lost. So this is this idea that things aren't as they seem, and one must exercise prudence and good judgment in determining the difference. That itself is an internal capacity related to both ethics and reasoning. I've before mentioned Sherlock Holmes and his reasoning methods, or more broadly Doyle, because Doyle wrote the character. That's the point. So we just say, no, that doesn't exist. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Well, how do you measure good judgment? How do you measure Sherlock Holmes's deductive qualities? You can't. So they don't exist. And once you convince people that they don't exist, the only foolproof way of determining the machine is gone. Because it could look like, so for example, Sauron used to have a fair appearance. He was called Anatar, the giver of gifts. He deceived the elves into even making the rings in the first place. So, if we don't have that sense because we're taught not to cultivate it, because it's not real, doesn't exist, then you can't see it for what it is until it reveals itself. Until it reveals itself, which I think it's beginning to do now. We see the fact that Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex is more true than ever before. It's this unending series of wars that serve no really apparent purpose, and one wonders how they can keep going, because throughout history, normally after a war, both sides have to stop and recuperate. Doesn't seem to be the case since 1991. It's been full, war all the way without break or let up. It's crazy. And that's of course this element of the magia of the machine to just break and dominate. And of course, and again, we've seen this in recent years, right? Some of my audience are Zoomers, but for millennials, I remember, right? We're going to develop genetic engineering to save humanity. We're going to do all these technologies to save, and improve human life. And of course, none of these improvements actually happened. Life is a lot worse than it was 30 years ago for many people, and it will continue to get worse for many people. But yet, it was that same pitfall that they fell for. Because ultimately, getting to play God for a little bit is a pretty seductive bargain. But then you get obsolete, and then you get thrown out, or you die, and then you no longer have that power. And I think this is also what causes what's called there's a certain guilt, not like survivor guilt, like you survived a battle that your buddy didn't, but competency guilt. Like people secretly feel that they aren't really deserving of the position that they have. Of course, they're never going to give it up. They get paid a lot of money for those positions. But this is why that guilt exists, because they don't actually have the inherent capacity to do it. But they don't need to, because the machine does it for them. Now, nobody's going to go in front of a camera and then, read from the machine stops. All hail the machine. The machine feeds us. The machine clothes us. The machine is our God. No one's going to say that, because then the jig is up. Then everybody knows. So rather than saying that, they're going to pretend that this little human cog that you just shunted in there for a moment, a twinkling of an eye, he's the one doing it. No, the machine is doing it. This cog is meant to obfuscate that fact. And so that is one of the key aspects here. And back to the idea of the wraithing process. The wraithing, so Bilbo says in the Fellowship of the Ring, he feels like butter spread over too much toast. His existence is attenuated. It's just getting stretched and stretched and stretched. Part of that attenuation is giving yourself up over to the machine so it does things for you. Now, in many regards, we don't have a choice, because the infrastructure has been developed that we have to rely on the machine for things. That's just how it is, as unfortunate as that is. But we don't have to rely on it on everything. And the first step in surviving this and rolling this back is not relying on the machine when you don't have to. And using your own judgment. If you don't have good judgment, then developing your own judgment. But this idea of because again, let's look at the ring wraiths, right? Their will is not their own. Their will is someone else's. It's Sauron's. Now, they have power. They can't be killed. At least not until Sauron is destroyed. But that's because they're being propped up by Sauron. He's lending them his power. And so a lot of people are like wraiths in that regard. You wonder, like, why can't we get through to certain people? This person is stuck. This person is stuck. Or they seem to act not in the way that you would expect, right? Oh, well, this person normally acts this way, but today he's acting this way. And we all know have friends or relatives like that. Well, that's sort of the wraithing process where that other will, that machine, is taking over. And so the Tolkien, in this sort of mythopoetic way, is really describing all of these things and giving us a context in which to understand them. And I think his idea of elf magic is very similar to Ted Kaczynski's idea of the power process. And they're both getting at the fact that what made human life meaningful was, yes, of course, other human relationships, but the fact that we did something that was in some sense self-directed and in some sense under our control, right? We're not like a part of an assembly line. We actually built something or taught somebody. And in doing all those things, we add value to the community, but also can feel satisfaction in the work that we did, which is just not the case anymore. So that is all I have for today's show. Let's see what we got in the chat. Euthanasia seems like a pretty neat topic. Well, thank you. Mr. C. Layman, remember when there was a frequent cues on apologetic programs in the zeros, i.e. Tolkien Lewis versus Rowling? Not quite, but yeah, Rowling should not be in that list. Nico, a good example of this is the gym. We need to use the gym now because we're too strong. Before, men were strong without it. I think you meant to say too weak, but yeah, I agree. If the process of collapse is slow enough, you can train people into these capacities. Well, it's like that poem. It started suddenly or slowly, then suddenly. I think they're losing control of it. Euthanasia. It's also interesting that the machine kills itself in its domination. Yes. Record deepness. Hello, all. Nico. Euthanasia. A good example is the Roman Empire. The very empire they built destroyed their own culture in the city of Rome, and in the end, everybody could be a Roman citizen. Hello. Sounds like a technology AI pretending there's no man behind the curtain. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Minoan. Hi, Todd. Hello, Minoan. All right, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.